HCP and since 2016. And since then, there's been significant changes in personnel and structure of their program. So that would be a good idea to get a briefing where we're at with the current HCP effort. The new KIUC rep and head for their effort is Dawn Huff. And we've been working very closely with her. The agencies have been. And Dawn will introduce the rest of her team. I was thinking we could just go around and do a quick introduction for everybody. And so it sounds like David is going to do a presentation on the status and components of the HCP. And then afterwards, we'll have some time for questions. So I'll just start out and I can, well, I don't know who everybody is on here, but I'll go around. And anyway, I'm the administrator with the Division of Forestry and Wildlife here in Honolulu, and have been following this project for a number of years. I'm also with the ESRC. I'm representing the chairman of the Department of Land and Natural Resources. So next, I guess, Kate, you want to go?
Sure, sorry. I'm Kate with DOFA. I'm just trying to get the live stream on the YouTube working, so I'll be busy for a moment.
Cool. David Zippin.
There we go, unmuted. Hello, everybody. Good morning. My name is David Zippin with ICF, and I'm the project director for the HCP. As Dawn will explain, we're one of the lead consultants preparing the HCP, and were brought on a couple of years ago. And I also lead ICF's practice in habitat conservation planning and implementation, and we prepare and implement HCPs and their NEPA documents all over the country.
Great, thank you, good to have you. Jim.
Good morning, I'm Jim Jacoby. I'm with U.S. Geological Survey Pacific Island Ecosystems Research Center and representing that organization on the ESRC.
Thank you. Loyal?
Hello, I'm Loyal Merhoff. I'm an at-large representative of the for the ESRC.
Thank you. Linda?
Hi, Linda Child, Deputy Attorney General, and I advise the ESRC.
Awesome, thank you. Michelle?
Aloha, good morning, everyone. I'm Michelle Bogardus. I'm the representative from the Fish and Wildlife Service. Good to see everyone.
Aaron?
Aaron Nadig, I'm a geographic manager working with the applicant on development of HCP.
Thank you. Efsheen?
Aloha, good morning. I'm Efsheen Siddiqui. I'm a wildlife biologist with Division of Forestry and Wildlife.
Thank you. Andre?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Andre Rain. I'm the Science Director for Archipelago Research and Conservation. And I've been working with mules and Hawaiian petrels for over a decade now.
Excellent. Beth?
Oh, hello, I'm Beth Tokioka. I'm the Communications Manager for KIUC.
Excellent, thank you. Bob?
Hi, everybody. This is Bob Reed. I'm the Deputy Director at USGS Pierce, working with Jim. And I'm actually only on the call briefly before a family obligation.
Good, okay, good to have you. Brad?
Hey, good morning, everybody. Brad Rockwell, Chief of Operations for KIUC.
Thank you. Let's see, Mr. Bissell.
Good morning, everybody. I'm David Bissell, President and CEO of KIUC.
Excellent. Thank you, David. Good morning. Good to have you here. Don?
Sorry, on mute. Hi, good morning, everyone. Dawn Huff. As David Smith mentioned, I'm the program manager for KIUC's Threatened and Endangered Species program. I started in this position a couple years ago in January of 2020. So I look forward to talking with you all today.
And it's been great having you on the team.
Thanks, David.
Kavika.
So my kako, Kavika Winter, sitting in the Native Hawaiian seat for ESRC.
Thank you. Laney, sorry.
Hi, I'm Lainey Berry. I'm the wildlife biologist at the Hawaii Division of Forestry and Wildlife.
Morning, Layla.
Good morning. I'm Layla Nagatani, and I'm biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I'm working on the KIUC HCP for our office.
Great. Layla's doing a great job. Let's see, Lisa.
Aloha, good morning. I'm Lisa Hadway Spain. I'm an at-large member of the ESRC, and I'm from Hawaii Island.
Good to see you. Melissa?
Good morning. My name is Melissa Price. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, working on wildlife management issues, and I'm representing UH Manoa today.
Great, thank you. Tori?
Hi, I'm Tori Dell. I am the project manager for ICF for the KIUC HCP.
Great. And I have a phone number, an 223 phone number.
Yeah, that's me because my computer mic isn't working properly.
Raja. Okay. Okay, I think that's everybody. Is there anybody I missed? I'm just going down my participant list that I see here. Great, thank you much. Awesome team. We've had a great team with KIUC, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has been doing a really good job. So, and then we've got a group here at DOFA. So we've been working through this HCP. It's, you know, a huge, giant thing. And so I think everybody's trying to do their best. And what I'm going to do now is hand it over, I believe, to David Bissell to give, or, you know, whoever at KIUC is going to take the lead, whether it be David or Don, and get a presentation to bring the ESRC up to speed. So go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My part in this is going to be very short. I just want to introduce KIUC. It's Kauai Island Utility Cooperative. We're an electric provider for the island of Kauai. We're a nonprofit cooperative. We were formed in 2002, and we're governed by elected board of directors, 9 members. And basically everyone who's electric user on the island is a member and participates in the cooperative. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Dawn Huff, and she'll start off on the presentation. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, David. Okay, so I just want to start with summarizing what we're going to cover today. We're going to provide some background information on KIUC and talk a little bit about why we need a habitat conservation plan. Andre Rain is going to give you a brief summary on the status of seabirds on Kauai. I know you all had a full briefing on that back in June. So we aren't going to belabor the point, but just to provide a little bit of a summary on that to help understand the areas of focus for the HCP. Then I'm going to give a general overview of KIUC's short-term HCP and how the conservation activities in the short-term HCP, particularly the monitoring, informed the development of the longer-term HCP that we hope to be presenting to you later this year. I'm also going to touch base on how the short-term HCP developed through the years and transitioned into early implementation of the longer-term HCP, which we're actually doing now. And then David Zippin's going to cover an overview of the longer-term HCP that we've been, as David Smith said, developing in collaboration with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and DOFA. So could we, yes, thank you. So the need for the HCP is really two primary categories: power line strikes and light attraction. And with power line strikes, those impact listed seabirds and to a lesser degree, listed waterbirds, also nene. And light attraction affects listed seabirds and the green sea turtle. The two primary species or primary impacts are on two of the listed seabird species, the Newell shearwater and the Hawaiian petrel. Okay, next slide, please. This is the team. David Smith mentioned in the introduction that we actually had a pretty big team change in early 2020. I came on board at that point as the program manager, and this past year in August, Trey Menard also joined our team. I think probably many of you know him. He used to work for the Nature Conservancy. And then we also in 2020 hired ICF to help us develop and draft the longer term HCP. That process had already been started previously, so we came in kind of midstream, and we're very close to completion. You met Andre earlier. I think many of you know him from his time at the Kauai Endangered Seabird Recovery Program. He's now with Archipelago Research and Conservation. And so Andre and Mark are key people on the team, still doing the things that they were doing for KIUC before, which is colony monitoring and power line monitoring. Pacific Rim Conservation, Lindsay Young has been a key team member in helping us develop plans for predator-proof fences on a couple of sites. Halleck's Ecological Restoration has done predator control for KIUC for the last 10 years and has been a big part of the team in helping develop predator control for the longer-term HCP. National Tropical Botanical Garden has, KIUC is in partnership with them, one of their management sites that it is at Upper Limahuli Preserve, and we fund NTBG to do predator control and vegetation control in the Upper Limahuli Preserve. And H.T. Harvey and Associates has provided technical expertise and assistance in developing the longer term HCP. And then the Koke'e Resource Conservation Program does some vegetation management for a couple of our sites. Okay, next slide, please. It's a big team. It's a good team. Andre, I'm going to ask if you'll cover the background on the status of Newell shearwater.
Sure. So just a quick summary on the status of Newells and Hawaiian petrel on Kauai. Through radar work between 1993 and 2013, we found that these species have experienced a significant sharp population decline. The Newells declined by 94% over that period of time, and the Hawaiian petrel by 78%. So definitely a huge population crash over those 2 decades. In more recent years, in the last 10 years, we've seen that population decline level out, but it's leveled out at a much lower population level. So basically these birds are now bumping along at a population level that is significantly reduced from the 90s. And with that decline, we're also seeing a huge contraction of the populations where they're breeding. Whereas before they would have, in like thousands of years ago, they would have been breeding all over the islands from the coast to the mountains. Now they're primarily restricted to the northwest of the island, and these are the more remote parts of Kauai, where they're furthest away from human impact. And the sort of key concentrated areas are actually the areas where a lot of the management work, the colony management work, is now being undertaken. These are places like Upper Limahuli, Upper Manoa, and Area Reserve, which are the sort of wet montane forests in which both species breed. And then we also have a good population of mules still in the Napali Cliffs, which is sort of dry, sheer cliff faces, the mules, and the third endangered seabird, the banded storm petrel nest. The large valleys of Wainiha and Lumahai and Hanalei, with the mountains of La'au and Molokama, also still retain some reasonable sized populations of these birds. And then Waimea Canyon is another stronghold for mule shearwaters and banded storm petrels. And then beyond those sort of main areas that I just described, we do have scattered remnant populations clinging on, but these ones are much reduced. And these would be places like the Kalaheo colony, which in the 90s would have had, they were monitoring Kalaheo colony, which had the same number of birds as Upper Limahuli does have today. And the last time I visited that site, which was maybe 5 years ago, it's like basically a ghost town of birds. There's like a couple of pairs scattered here or there. They're also hanging on in places like Sleeping Giant, Haupu, some of the interior spots, but those areas outside of that sort of northwest of the island are scattered in remnant populations. And that's kind of where we are today with these two species, plus the storm petrel.
Thank you, Andre. Next slide, please. Okay, so the short-term HCP. I know many of you, maybe all of you, are familiar with KIUC's short-term HCP, which was approved in 2011. It covered the 3 listed seabirds, Newell shearwater, Hawaiian petrel, and banded storm petrel. The conservation strategy included minimization projects to reduce power line collisions, minimization of light attraction through the installation of full cutoff shielded lights on street lights, and funding of the SOS program to support the rehabilitation of injured birds. It also included management of seabird breeding colonies in Upper Limahuli Preserve and the initiation of the power line monitoring program. In addition to conservation and protection of the endangered species, another one of the primary purposes of the short-term HCP was to gather information and data through those short-term HCP conservation actions to help inform a longer-term HCP. Okay, so next slide, please. So this slide shows a map of, you can see the cutout in the bottom right-hand screen there of where it is on the island, which is that same area that Andre was talking about, where in the northwest corner of Kauai, where the remaining populations primarily are located. The first conservation site was Upper Limahuli Preserve. And then in the first year of the program, KIUC added 3 additional sites that are located in Hononapali Nature Area Reserve, Pihea, Pohakea, and North Bog, which you can see there. So 4 sites in that first year. The additional 3 sites in the NAR, it was a limited, in the beginning, it was a limited effort with some monitoring and limited predator control. And then those efforts were increased over the next 3 to 4 years to full management level that occurs today. In 2015, KIUC added some limited monitoring and acoustic sensors in Upper Manoa, which you can see on the next map. There we go. It it borders Upper Limahuli Preserve there, one shared border there with Upper Limahuli Preserve. And the efforts increased in Upper Manoa over the next few years, so that by 2018, it was full colony monitoring and predator control were being implemented at the site. And then in 2021, KIUC took over the management of Hanakapiai and Hanakoa, also located in the NAR. You can see there in red and blue. And in 2022, we are adding an additional site, the Pohakea Social Attraction Site, which is a small area within the greater Pohakea site that is inside of a predator exclusion fence. The fence and the site were developed through funding by DOFA, and DOFA has agreed to let KIUC take over the long-term management of that site starting this year. So as you can see, there's been a steady growth of breeding colony management activities since the start of the short-term HCP. As of 2022, we'll be managing almost all of the sites that are included in the longer-term HCP. Management actions at these sites include colony monitoring, predator control, and vegetation control. And we've just seen significant success over the years. So that's helped to inform what we are planning for the long-term HCP. Okay, Andre, I'm going to turn it back over to you for monitoring, colony monitoring.
Actually, Don, would you mind just going back to that slide of the main map first? Yeah, so just looking at that map to orientate you, to orientate everyone, you know, the reason why these sites have been added to over the years is as we gain more information on the distribution of the birds, both species across the island, they're both extremely hard species to study because, like I said, they're in these remote areas and they're in really difficult areas to work in. But the Newell shearwater has been a particularly challenging bird because it's the more restricted of the two. And so when you look at that map, Upper Limahuli and Upper Manoa and the northern section of Pohakea really are our sort of main Newell strongholds, which is why that social attraction site has appeared inside Pohakea, because it's right amongst where we know there's a lot of Newells and a lot of Newell's passage. And then Hanakapiai and Hanakoa and the northern section of North Bog are sort of like a central area where we have pockets of Newells and a lot of Hawaiian petrels. And then North Bog and Pahea are our main sort of Hawaiian petrel areas, with Pahea having a small pocket of Newells on the Kalanau Rim. So the birds are not evenly distributed across those areas, and the species are not evenly distributed across those areas. And this is the reason why, you know, you have to, trying to find management sites where you can actively manage the birds, and particularly Newells, is a very challenging process. But you know, we've been getting there, and today it's quite a lot of management areas in the sort of strongholds of the birds where we can actually get boots on the ground and do the fine predator control work that Don was mentioning, as well as monitoring to assess the effectiveness of that work. Okay, Don, so if you, yeah, there we go. So just, this is a really
quick question, Andre. Go back one slide. I wasn't, maybe it's not this HCP, but I thought there was a site added on the Kokea side of the Kalalau Rim. Is it a different HCP?
Don, that Kavika's talking about Hanapu there.
Yeah.
Or maybe the KSHCP site.
Yeah, it could be either one. Hanapu, which has been being developed in partnership with DOFA and through some grant funding, and then the KSHCP site, which is closer on that side of things, also towards the Hanapu side.
Okay, yeah, different HCP. Thank you.
Can I ask you a question also, Andre? The monitoring that you're doing up there in terms of populations, are you able to come up with enough information to be able to use that kind of data to document offset of take or mitigation for take?
Yeah, Jim, it is something we've been sort of working on over the years. We've now come up with a system for creating population sizes within each colony, which was a long process to come to and required a lot of data to get to that point. But we can now create population sizes, and we can create get a handle on the number of chicks that are being produced because of management actions. With what the number of chicks would be like without management, and what the number of chicks that are being produced now with management are. And coupled with that, we also use saw meters to look at population trends within each site to see how, as a colony, each colony is benefiting from management.
Okay, great.
So
yeah, I'm hoping that that'll be well documented in the proposed, in the HCP, because it'd be good to really have that background so we can really, be able to see how that really relates to take mitigation.
Yeah, and I guess Don, we will on the next time we meet go into that kind of detail in much more detail, because we certainly can speak to that quite easily.
Great,
yeah. So Jim, today's presentation is really just to give you sort of an overview, a precursor of what's to come. And the next time we present, we're going to do a deep dive on the long-term HCP and all the data that's been collected and that has informed the long-term HCP.
Great, thank you.
So this is a single slide to describe 10 years of blood, sweat, and tears in the mountains. So it's kind of hard to just gloss over it in a minute, but I will. So basically, colony monitoring involves going to these really remote sites. Most of them are accessible only by helicopter, and using several different methods to monitor the colonies and assess how the colonies are reacting to management work, which is primarily predator control and some invasive plant control. And so at the core of it is borough monitoring. And you can see there we've got a couple of Hawaiian petrels who've just arrived for the start of the season, busy nuzzling each other and prepping for the laying of an egg. And so with borough monitoring, what we're doing is we're following these burrows, of which we have almost 1,500 now that we are monitoring. Which is quite a lot of burrows. A large proportion of those are Hawaiian petrels, but we're sort of probably in the region of closing in on 300 mules as well. So it's a really good sample size that's spread out across all of these different sites. And we check the burrows on a regular basis, so 7 times during the season, and we collect sufficient data from those burrow checks to calculate reproductive success rates, which Jim is one of the key things that we use for understanding how management is producing more chicks. And basically what we do is we go in late February, early March to set up the equipment before the birds arrive, which is just around the corner. Even though the last season just ended, we're getting ready to do it again. And then we follow the burrows all the way through till the last birds are fledging in December. And then the last birds would be the Hawaiian petrels, the last mules are fledging in November. And as well as monitoring all those burrows, and the burrow monitoring involves assessing each burrow on each check for signs of breeding activity. In some cases, we can access the back either visually, or we use handheld cameras by just sticking your arm in and taking photographs to see what's inside. Like, is there a bird incubating? Is there a chick? And so on. But for 30 burrows at each site, we also monitor them continuously with remote wildlife cameras. And so those are Reconyx cameras. They're set up in front of the burrows, and they have a IR, so they don't cause flashes at night when the birds are coming in. They don't disturb the birds at all, but those are really key for getting a lot more information on detailed information on the breeding bird, their breeding phenology, helping with assessing reproductive success for deeper burrows, and also critically understanding predator interactions around burrows. So when we get things like cats on those cameras, we can pass that information immediately on to NTBG and HALEX so that they can carry out rapid predator control actions if necessary. And then while those, the burrow monitoring is absolutely key for understanding things like reproductive success, there is a subset of the burrows that exists within the site, because obviously we don't find all the burrows. You're never going to find all the burrows in a place like Limahuli or Hanakapiai or any of the management sites. And so we also use acoustic monitoring through song meters. And the song meters are set up across all the management sites at about 250 meters apart. And they're static sites, so we've been running them year after year after year. And what we use those for, we collect the data, send that to Conservation Metrics in California, who analyze the data for us, because we're talking like tens of thousands of hours. And they provide us with call rate change over time. And call rate is significantly related to the number of burrows that's on the ground around the song meters. And so therefore, as call rate changes, you can use that as a proxy for understanding how the colony as a whole is benefiting from predator control. And so as call rates increase over time, you know there's more breeding birds. If call rates were to decrease on the other hand, then you know that something was going wrong. And so those burrow searching, burrow monitoring, song meters, and auditory surveys, which we don't have on the slide, but we also do auditory surveys to help plot the distribution of birds across the sites, help us locate new breeding burrows, and also get a handle on things like barn owls that might be flying around and are particularly problematic predator. That's the colony monitoring in a nutshell. And while we're doing all this work in the colonies to look at what is in essence take offset, we're also looking at annual collision rates through our power line monitoring work, and that's through our subproject IMP, which is Infrastructure Monitoring and Minimization Project or program. And we use three different methods for that, three primary methods. The first and possibly the most important is acoustic monitoring. Because acoustic monitoring, you can see there on that bottom left-hand map, those are deployments of roving units since 2013. And basically the idea here is we have these song meters. It's the same song meters that we use up in the mountains to listen for the sound of birds hitting power lines. Traditionally, the idea had been to just walk along underneath power lines and look for dead birds. But as we know, majority of birds that hit power lines do not end up underneath the power line. So it's a massive underestimate of what's going on. Whereas the acoustic monitoring allows you to monitor all year round across the island to get a handle on the sound of birds, to listen to the sound of these birds hitting the lines, because they make a very distinctive twanging sound when they hit the line. And then through the use of Bayesian models to project the information that's collected from the acoustic monitoring across the whole island to create annual take. And that's a method which we've refined over the years and is now an accepted method for identifying, assessing take monitoring. And that's spearheaded by Mark Travers, who runs our IMP project. And on our next presentation, we'll have Mark here to talk in much more detail about that process. The second thing, which is also a critical element of power line monitoring, is observer surveys. And for this, we have observers who go to areas of where power line collisions are occurring, or power lines, and they spend hour after hour watching the lines with night vision to look for collisions themselves. And it's kind of like a needle in a haystack. You have to spend thousands of hours to get a good sample size of birds hitting power lines. But the importance of that data and the blood, sweat, and tears that goes into that is that that can then be used to assess species ratios. So understanding with the listed birds, what percentage is Hawaiian petrels hitting the lines and what is Mule shearwaters. And also in some areas, and Dawn had mentioned this earlier, water birds, there are certain areas where observer surveys are important for understanding also the ratio of water bird collisions. And then on top of that, as well as species ratios, observer surveys are really important for understanding the immediate impacts of collisions. So if you think about song meters are just listening for sound, and you hear that twang, you're like, okay, a bird hit a line. But you need the people on the ground to be watching to say, okay, well, when the bird hits the line, does it immediately drop and die? What percentage of them do that? What percentage of them lose altitude and disappear into the distance on a downward trajectory? And what percentage of them, conversely, hit the power line and keep going? So that observer surveys are really important for creating grounding rates, which feed into the annual collision rate calculations. And then lastly, and particularly importantly in the last year and a half, and this year as well, is going to be assessing how the birds are interacting or otherwise with minimization efforts. And Don will be talking a lot about that or in a bit, but it's things like diverters, all these different methods that we've been trialing to reduce take, because reducing take has been an absolutely key thing. We know that take is large, very large on this island, much larger than was originally thought at the very beginning. But the good news is that a lot of this take is concentrated in key areas. And so you can, really pile on minimization efforts into these areas. But when you do that, because these are new techniques, you need to be able to watch and see how the birds interact. Does it work? In the worst case scenario, some of these minimization efforts attract birds. Luckily, we found that's not the case, but you need to have people on the ground checking this to make sure that everything's safe. And then lastly, that map on the right there shows, where observed collisions are. And you can see that map sort of speaks to what I was saying, where there are a lot of collisions, but they're in key areas. And those key areas then can really help KIUC focus minimization efforts. And then there's down birds, and down birds are an important supplement to the other two methods. Whereas before it was thought that you could just walk along and count down birds. We know that's not the case, but down birds are still really important for understanding things like an immediate assessment of injuries for down birds, like how do they injure themselves, like what damage is occurring to them. And also things like age structure, what proportion of birds are adults versus subadults, which is a really tricky question, which we've been working on and using carcasses and necropsies to try to get a handle on. So again, a lot of work and effort going into assessing annual collision rates, species ratios, and how to reduce those in an effective way. So I got for that one.
Thanks, Andre. This slide is just a summary of all the data collection that Andre talked through in the previous two slides. And one additional piece, we didn't have a slide specifically dedicated to predator control, but that's a primary activity that we do, management activity that we implement, and we do predator control monitoring that is associated with that. So all of these data collection methods have weighed in and informed the development of the long-term HCP. And again, when we're presenting to you later this year, we'll go into a lot more detail on the data collection and the modeling that's been done for the long-term HCP. But we just wanted to mostly point out that it was through the short-term HCP and this interim period of time between the short-term HCP and the long-term HCP that we have been doing that data collection. Because when the short-term HCP started, there was very little data and very little information. So this was a really important part of the short-term program. Okay.
Dawn, sorry, could I just add to that slide? In terms of predator control, I think, we can't stress enough how important predator control has been and how it has evolved over time through this HCP process. While we've been learning a hell of a lot with our colony monitoring and power line take monitoring, the predator control has also been really important for understanding how predator control has a positive effect to the colonies and evolving those methods. And that's the excellent work that HALEX Ecosystem Restoration and NTPG have been doing in the respective management sites. And it's been really interesting to see, the evolution of technologies, the rolling out of things like good nature traps, the adaptation of different trapping methods to deal with what are extremely challenging animals that can cause devastating impacts on these colonies. And then even now, predator control is evolving to deal with emerging threats, things like barn owls, which are particularly tricky predators to deal with, bee invasions that we're now finding. So predator control and the data collection that's been occurring through predator control over the last 10 years has really been vital too in terms of informing this long-term HCP process.
Thanks, Andre, for that added detail.
Ask a quick question. Andre, is all this research you're talking about, I think it was formerly funded by the short-term HCP. Is it continued to be funded, or did you need to find alternative funding?
Everything we're talking about here is funded by KIUC.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we're going to transition to talk about minimization. As Andre pointed out, that's a really key aspect of KIUC's program. So during the, well, we have some basic methods of minimization techniques that we have used and we know work. Those are static wire removal, installation of reflective and LED diverters, and reconfiguration of power lines. And during the short-term HCP, all of these were implemented to some extent, with the primary focus being, as I mentioned before, on not just reducing collisions, but also testing and monitoring to determine efficacy. Andre was talking about this a little bit earlier. So in the last few years, that data collection has informed modeling, and we've received projections of estimated efficacy rates to help inform KIUC's monitoring minimization program. So in 2020, we started a pretty major minimization plan that between 2020 and 2023 will ultimately result in about a 65, this is estimated 65% efficacy rate island-wide. So the slide that we're looking at here, the top image is what a sort of a typical power line configuration will look like. And the bottom image is after what the power line looks like in the field after both static wire removal and reflective diverters. You can see that the static wire there, as the top wire, has been removed from those that H-frame. And you can see the diverters hanging from the wires, the remaining wires. Okay, next slide, please.
Actually, sorry, I couldn't see that. Could you point that out with your mouse or something? I couldn't connect the words to what I'm seeing.
That's the diverters hanging there. And if you go to the top of that H-frame, you see there's no wire coming from the top. That was where the static wire was removed. We have some better photos in a couple of the next slides also. I think the diverters show up a little better. Here we go. So the photo on the left, that's reflective diverters hanging. You can see they're kind of bright, shiny white colored. They reflect the sun. And the photo on the right is an image of an LED diverter, which has a blinking light through the night. LEDs we primarily use in areas that are away from roadways or housing developments for safety reasons. But the reflective diverters can be used anywhere on the system. They last for into the wee hours of the night. So they cover that prime time when birds are flying out to sea in the evening. Okay, next slide. So on the left here, we have a schematic. Again, this is just demonstrating what happens with static wire removal, but also with a reconfiguration. So the pole on the left shows what a typical configuration might look like. This is a vertical configuration with the 4 layers there, the static wire on top, and then the 3 layers of lines, both transmission and distribution, and sometimes communications also. And then the image on the right in the schematic shows what it looks like after static wire removal and after reconfiguration. So you can see that the top wire is gone in that image on the right, and the 3 layers are reduced to 2 layers. In some cases, the image on the right shows lines coming off of the top of the two layers, and in other cases, it might be lines coming off the top and lower arms of those 2 layers. And then the photo on the right is a lineman actually removing a static wire. You can see, I think you can see at the top of the pole there where the static wire is still connected, and he's removing that.
So Don, for those of us who aren't electrical engineers, what is a static wire and what is it for?
Okay, that's a good question. David Bissell or Brad, I wonder if you'd be willing to answer that.
Static wire is primarily to help dissipate electrical charges if there's lightning. So we've had most of our tall transmission poles throughout the island have had static wire on. We've been in the process of removing essentially all of it. Our engineers have analyzed the trade-off between reliability and potential bird take and have decided they can take the static wires down.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.
And I do have one more question on this slide before you go on, but I'll let you finish.
Oh, I'm finished. Go ahead.
Okay, so how does this relate to the bird flyaway zone in a vertical here? I mean, vertical.
Two primary ways. So it reduces height. So it reduces, the height in the air, but it also reduces the number of layers that birds may come in contact with. So as opposed to the four layers or 3 layers.
I'm sorry, that part I understand. I guess my question is, what is the vertical area that is the flyway for birds? And how do the poles match up with that?
Yeah,
okay. Between 5 feet and 50 feet, or are they all within this, they all come in 20 feet above sea level, or what does it look like?
I see. Andre?
Yeah, Kavika, that's a good question. It entirely depends on the location of the power lines relative to where the birds are. So, like birds may fly higher or lower depending on wind direction and topography. But typically, as like a generalization, it's that top line, which is the worst line. And in some cases, the top line causes most of the collisions. So if you can remove the static line, immediately you're removing like a large proportion of strikes because there's no line there for the birds to hit. And then as Don said, as you start tucking those lines down and removing those layers, then all those additional, as you get further on down the line, it becomes less of an impact for the birds. But in some areas, like somewhere like the power line trail, where the poles are just there and there's the ridge and the drainage, the birds are just coming up and they can move into any of the lines. So all of these sort of minimization techniques have to take into account, that where it is located to where the topography and where the birds are flying.
Thank you. So the related question is, when you were doing your monitoring for the twangs, were you monitoring all the levels, and that's how you know that the static line had the most hits, or is that an assumption somehow?
That's from the observations. So while the acoustics will pick up the sound of a twang and it's hit a line, the observations are also really critical for understanding which lines those birds are hitting, and also importantly, which lines they're hitting in different areas. So, when you think about these observations and the tens of thousands of hours that have occurred, it's also got to be, it has to be done in a way where it's taking into account all the different scenarios with different lines and different topography and different flight paths. So we've tried to make sure that the observations are spread across the island and then concentrated in key areas where we know a lot of the collisions are occurring.
Okay, so follow-up question. So in an area like Kealia corridor, the static line might have a disproportionately large amount of hits, but on some place like power line trail, the static line removal isn't going to be maybe as important as the bringing everything into one layer. Is that correct?
Right. It depends on location. So we would look at each location and be like, okay, well, this is what the birds are doing there, and this is what we know are the worst parts, and then this is the minimization that you could do to fix that.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
One of the things that we got in 2020 from Andre and Mark was a span by span estimated strike and estimated minimization efficacy for each individual span, a span being the length of line from pole to pole. We got that for the entire system. And that allowed us to plan minimization and focus minimization the appropriate minimization in areas with higher strikes, but also to take into consideration the specifics that were going on in each area, like you were just talking about with Powerline Trail versus Kealia. So that was a pretty critical piece of information that we got in 2020, and thus it allowed us to initiate this extensive minimization program that we're in the middle of now. Okay, next slide. This is a little bit about the light attraction minimization we've done with light attraction. In 2017, KIUC retrofitted their street lights to in two ways. They switched to energy efficient 3000 kilowatt LED bulbs, but more importantly, they installed full cutoff shielded fixtures on their existing street lights. And also the part of the plan is for that those full cutoff shielded fixtures will be installed on new street lights. So the image on the right is a photo of what that full cutoff shielded fixture looks like. That's just what the current streetlights look like on Kauai. And then the image on the bottom of the slide on the right-hand side is an image of the full cutoff, how the light is directed with a full cutoff shield. So downward, and preventing the light from shining above that 90-degree horizontal plane. And it's not listed on this slide, but another significant light attraction minimization that KIUC has implemented is that they installed dimming features on facility lights, particularly at the Port Allen Generation Station, which is the facility most with the greatest risk of light attraction. And those were installed, the dimming features were installed in early 2019. And we have seen a dramatic drop in light attraction at Port Allen since that time. So they basically dim the facility lights during fallout season. And so far we're pleased with the results. Okay.
Clarifying question. I thought the lights were a DOT issue. So are we talking just the some lights or all street lights? Can you clarify, please?
So KIUC owns and operates many streetlights on Kauai, not all of them. Some of them are in private developments that aren't under KIUC's operations, but it's an interesting, the streetlights are an interesting combination of KIUC owns and operates them, but the county and the state, the planning of those and the regulations of installation locations and wattage and all of that are through the county and the state. So we are working with the county and the state on other potential minimization, but this is what has been done to date as part of KIUC's program.
Okay, thanks, Don. Maybe somebody from DOFA can clarify that there's the other HCP that DOT isn't on the hook for lights. Is that exclusively at the harbors? I'm just trying to parse things out in my mind.
Harbors and airports.
That one is the harbors and the airport.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, next slide. Okay, I'm sure many of, maybe probably all of you are familiar with the Save Our Shearwaters program. It was initiated in 2003, and it's a rehabilitation program for, used to be only in listed species, but it's grown in the last few years to include non-listed species as well. KIUC has been the primary funder for the SOS program since it started. And you can see there on the right a table that just shows level of funding each year that KIUC has provided. We're currently around approximately the 300,000 level of funding. But in the last couple of years, there's been a pretty significant additional funding above and beyond that 300,000, which covers operational needs. But the additional funding has been provided to support the relocation of SOS into a new facility. And that was a staged relocation. So it's been a sort of a full-on effort the last couple of years, but they're in their new facility now and up and operational in that new facility. So this is also, SOS will also be part of the ongoing long-term HCP as well. Okay, next slide. Okay, I think I mentioned earlier that, around the end of 2019, beginning of 2020, we really shifted out of what I think of as the short-term HCP into early implementation of the longer-term HCP, even though it is still in process, in discussion with the agencies. The development of it we knew enough information to be switching over to early implementation in 2020. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the key components of that was the minimization of power line collisions. To date, with all the minimization combined, short-term HCP period plus the early implementation, 112 miles of lines have been minimized. And we have, at the end of December 2021, we had achieved an estimated island-wide efficacy of about 34%. With the whole, once we complete the entire minimization plan, at the end of 2023, we have an estimated island-wide efficacy of about 65%. So basically reducing power line collisions by a little over 65%. And that's based on that span specific information that I mentioned earlier.
Don, the first two bars, 20 and 21, are those actual data, and 22 and 23 are projected? Is that correct?
20 and 21 is actual, that's based on actual implementation. It has already occurred. 2022 and 2023 are planned projects. And that may get shifted around in terms of how much happens in each year, but the commitment to the projects is firm. So it's not that the projects are moving around or the efficacy commitment to the efficacy is moving around. It's just, it may get shifted between the years, if that makes sense.
And is this aligned with the priority area?
I'm sorry, you're muted.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is this aligned with the, is this prioritized according to the high take areas?
Yes, it's using that same information, the span by span estimated strikes and estimated efficacy for minimization. Yes. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to David Zippin now, who's going to talk, give a little bit of an overview on the long-term HCP.
Great, thank you, Dawn. And these are the topics I'll cover. We'll go into more detail at our next meeting about the take estimates themselves, as well as how we think the conservation measures will benefit the covered species and offset those levels of take and the impacts of that taking. So in terms of covered species, you've already heard this, but just a reminder, these are the same three covered seabirds that were in the short-term HCP, so no change there, except that in 2016, Of course, the Ban Rump Storm Petrel was federally listed, so that is a change since the short-term HCP, at least for the Hawaii distinct population segment. And then these are additional covered species for the long-term HCP. Because of new information that we've learned since 2016, we now know that there is a risk of take of these water birds and nene from collisions with power lines in very specific parts of the island where these species tend to breed and forage. And in addition, there's indication as well recently that there's a risk of sea turtles, green sea turtles that are nesting in areas where KIUC operates certain streetlights, that there may be hatchling disorientation from those streetlights. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. So these are the covered activities that the long-term HCP is proposing to include. So a little more detail on the power lines themselves. Just over 1,000 miles of power lines and their operation. And you can see the split there between transmission, distribution, and a small amount of communication lines as well. The power line retrofits are going to be covered as well, as will the operation of new or extended power lines. The permit term proposed, and I'll have a slide on that next, is for a 30-year period. And so you can imagine certainly there will be power lines added as the island's population grows. And so we want to anticipate that in the HCP, and we've projected about 211 circuit miles of new wires will be added during that period. That will be covered as well. And then a small component is in very limited circumstances, in emergency situations, KIUC may need to restore power at night and work on this equipment at night and use night lighting to do that safely. And if that happens to occur during the fallout season, we want to be sure KIUC is covered for that limited risk. With lights, we were just talking about that. As Don mentioned, KIUC operates just over 4,000 streetlights on the island. That's not all of them, but it is most of them on the island. And we expect more streetlights that the county and the state are going to be planning and requiring be built. And then KIUC will be operating those as well. It's about a 25% increase in streetlights that we project over that same 30-year period. Don mentioned the Port Allen Generating Station. That is one of two facilities that the HCP will be covering. Also the Kauai Generating Station. Those are both shown on the map as yellow triangles in the southern part of the island. You can see them there. And then similarly, if there is a need for repair to streetlights at night, and the night lighting that would occur to that if it occurred during the fallout season. So I mentioned our proposed permit term is 30 years, and that would be both for the federal incidental take permit and the state incidental take license. We've arrived at that 30-year permit term for a number of reasons, but it is based on the HCP's conservation strategy, including many of the conservation actions that have been occurring already for many years. We know a lot about the management of the conservation sites, the monitoring of those conservation sites, and the monitoring of power lines. And so we believe that for that reason and others, it's well justified to have a longer permit term for this long-term HCP. And then certainly there is some scientific uncertainty that remains. This is a complicated system to work in, and that's the purpose of adaptive management. It's a required component of HCPs. So we are working with DOFA and Fish and Wildlife Service to develop that adaptive management program for the HCP. And we'll share some of those outcomes with you at a future meeting.
Can you explain what this slide shows?
That would be for Andre to explain.
Yeah, that's actually the social attraction site we prepared it in Upper Manoa. So what you can see there are artificial nest boxes for mules and Hawaiian petrels. And then this year, we put those in 2 years ago to get them ready for once the fence encircles the site, we can start attracting birds in. And we also this year planted somewhere in the region of 290 native plants on that site too. It was a pretty degraded hill. And we planted a bunch of native species for both understory and canopy. So it'll be nice to see that particular spot, the plants grow and turn into more native habitat. And then once the fence is up, start attracting the birds in. And we've currently got somewhere in the region of 30 boxes there. But broadly speaking, that's what multiple social attraction sites are going to look like within the management areas.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Andre. And I imagine the bags on top are just weights to weight them down.
Currently, those ones are just to weight the lids down to make sure the lids don't blow open. But what we had last year, we actually put eye buttons inside the boxes to measure the temperature of the boxes compared to natural burrows. And we found that those boxes are actually a little warmer than the natural burrows. So we're going to be adding more sandbags to totally cover the boxes and maybe actually dig them a little deeper to give them more insulation.
Keep them cooler. Great. All right. Thanks.
Would you mind going back one slide?
Sure.
So I'm trying to wrap my brain around the group today has presented a number of minimization methods, and obviously those don't take it to zero, right? Like total shielding of lights is pretty great. The power line minimization methods are a great improvement. With all of this planned, I guess in my head, I'm trying to wrap my brain around like, what's the tipping point? Now that we know how to minimize with total shielding, can you just keep adding lights and it won't cause a problem? Or is there some sort of tipping point where you go, we can probably add lights with the total shielding up to this point, and now we're back in trouble. Or, we've got the minimization methods on the power lines. It's an improvement. It doesn't totally stop mortalities from taking place. And so we can add X more miles before we're back in trouble again. I'm just trying to wrap my brain around like a combination of the minimization methods, but oh shoot, things are expanding. Should I be worried? Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, Melissa, those are great questions. And at least for the power lines, we will cover that at a future meeting. We've developed a population dynamics model to project the population of both mule shearwater and Hawaiian petrel on the island with all of those factors you're describing changing over time. So with the minimization of power lines that Don explained will be completed by the end of 2023, with the improvements to the conservation sites that will take some time to be built and installed. And then of course, the social attraction sites that also take time to attract the birds. So we are trying to factor all of that in. And we know certainly collisions will continue to occur even with 65% minimization. So this is a take permit after all. We can't eliminate the risk of take. We know it will continue, so we have to offset that somehow. So we have factored the power lines into the model. We have a different story when it comes to the streetlights because the streetlights, of course, are not the only source of light attraction on Kauai. There's a lot of other light sources, and so we have had to come up with some very rough estimates of KIUC's contribution to fallout based on the location and number of streetlights in various high-risk areas. It is a very low number, much, much lower than the power line. So frankly, we don't think the streetlights, KIUC's operation of the streetlights contribute much to the overall population issues on the island. But that's part of what you'll be reviewing when you see our effects analysis. So
Thank you,
I hope
David.
that helps.
Yeah, thank you. I'll really look forward to when you present the PVA. I know the inputs of those are so important, and it sounds like that may answer some of the questions here, but it sounds like an estimate of a calculation of an estimate of a calculation going into those things. So it'll be interesting to dig down into. Thanks so much.
Sure. Yeah, it's tricky, but it's a tool we think we have to have in order to answer those questions. Yeah. Great. All right, so just a few slides about the impact mechanisms. Don and Andre already alluded to these earlier, and these are some of the factors, of course, that will be inputs to our population dynamics model. For power line collisions, it's not just the seabirds and waterbirds that are injured or killed, but also the loss of any eggs or chicks that haven't fledged yet that are associated with those injured or killed adults. So we have to consider that when we're considering the effects of power line collision. With light attraction, it's a little more straightforward in terms of the mechanism, but really challenging to estimate numerically because of those factors I described. With seabird fallout due to KIUC streetlights, only a share, and we think a relatively small share of the attraction from all other light sources on the island, most of which are not minimized at all. And then the green sea turtle hatchling disorientation, which I will talk about on a next slide. In terms of estimating take from power line collisions, Andre gave you a great overview of the underlying monitoring program and all of the data that they've been collecting for a number of years. So we do have the benefit of that data. It's a lot of hours, and you can see some of the counts of how many hours Andre and Mark and their staff have spent doing this incredibly challenging monitoring. And from that, we can estimate collisions based on the acoustic strike data, making a number of assumptions of what that means in terms of collisions that actually result in take, because of course, not all strikes result in an injury or mortality. And then those estimates are what we can use as inputs to our population model regarding take that would continue even after completion of all of the minimization projects. So again, more details on this to come. But to note the map on the right, which is an estimate of the risk of strikes in various parts of KIUC's system. If you recall an earlier slide that Andre spoke to that had actual counts of strikes, cumulative strikes, and those do correspond to these sort of red and orange and even yellow areas. It's more of a heat map of where the risk of collisions is greatest. And of course, those are the areas that KIUC has either already focused their minimization projects or will be doing so this year and next year.
I have a question relating to this. Maybe Andre might be the best person to answer. So my understanding was that there were large data gaps in the power line monitoring due to the height of the lines, particularly over Power Line Trail. So was I misunderstanding that, or how did you overcome that to create this figure?
Yeah, so this figure shows is a strike rate figure based on in this case I think this was from the acoustic monitoring, and so we overcame that issue. I think what you're referring to is somewhere like the Power Line Trail, where is if you were trying to count birds that are hitting lines and going to the ground, you're never going to find them. And so the acoustic monitoring is absolutely key for scenarios like that, but also key for understanding strike totals across the island and across the year, because you can't be watching all the lines all the time. And so I think that might answer your question, Kavika, but the other thing to
Yeah,
note,
so just, I guess, to put it concisely, was there or is there acoustic monitoring on all areas of the line, particularly power line trail?
yeah, the power line trail is pretty saturated with acoustic monitoring and observer monitoring as well. And even more so now, because a lot of the minimization actions are occurring there, and it's a good place to start testing the efficacy of those things. So that area is pretty saturated, but that map there on the left shows where rovers have been deployed over the years. And the thing with the Bayesian model is basically, and Mark will speak to this in detail, he developed the model with Tim Tinker. But the key with that Bayesian model is to take these rovers, which are only deployed during the peak strike period, which is May through August, for a month at a time, and to take the strikes that are recorded from those rovers and run them through the Bayesian model so that it can model the number of strikes that that unit would record over time, over the whole season. And the Bayesian model also takes into account things like weather and the factors we were talking about before in terms of location of the birds, you know, where the birds are flying and what the topography is like. So it's an extremely complex model, which is actually running multiple models at the same time. But it does produce these, I think that map there in particular visualizes, it's a really good way of visualizing. When you look at it, you're like, okay, well, there's obviously some key areas that we need to deal with. And those are certainly the areas that KIUC have been focusing on major minimization efforts.
Okay, that answers my question. Thank you.
Thanks, Andre. So in terms of green sea turtles, we knew this was not a problem throughout KIUC's streetlights on the island. And so to really narrow down on where this was a problem, KIUC and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service jointly surveyed all of the beaches on the island that had streetlights anywhere nearby. And this was done both in 2019 and in 2020 with a resurvey. And through that effort, they identified 29 streetlights. So out of the 4,100 streetlights, less than 1% were located at 7 beaches where sea turtle nesting habitat exists, and the streetlight is visible at beach level, and so therefore could be a risk to any green sea turtle hatchlings that emerge at that location. So we've identified those 29 streetlights as the ones where we would be focusing our conservation measure. We're also taking into account the fact that this is likely to shift over time. This is a 30-year permit. Beach conditions can certainly change with either erosion or accretion, especially after large storms or hurricanes. There, in some cases, is existing vegetation or buildings that are shielding the beach from an existing streetlight. If that situation changes, a new location could be exposed to streetlight, and vice versa if new buildings are constructed or vegetation simply just grows and becomes a new shield. So we will be taking those changes into account into the HCP as well. And you can see the map on the right are the locations of all of those 29 streetlights and 7 beaches. So briefly, to summarize the KIUC HCP and its proposed conservation measures, as we've been saying, many of these conservation measures have been implemented already, some for a number of years. Those would simply continue throughout the 30-year permit term, with the exception of the power line minimization projects, which will be finished by the end of next year. Light attraction minimization is completed. So as Don explained, now all of KIUC streetlights have that full cutoff shielding. All new lights that KIUC inherits will also have that same shielding. The SOS program funding would continue And then KIUC would continue to manage the 8 sites they manage today, as well as add what we estimate is 2 more sites for a total of 10. And then we'll discuss with you next time 2 new programs that KIUC expects to include. One of them is to address the green sea turtle hatchling disorientation, and that would be what we call our nest detection and temporary beach shielding. So that's actually to shield individual nests on the beach from any street lights that might be nearby. And then the other one is one KIUC is evaluating still to see if it will perform the way we would like. And that is a focused and sort of targeted management of feral cats in a certain part of the island where we expect to have the greatest benefits to the covered seabirds. So again, we'll bring that back to you next time and explain that in more detail.
So does that mean we're not going to hear about predator-proof fences today?
No, you'll hear about them right now.
Okay.
And I did want to mention the 10 conservation sites and sort of give you the full picture of what the HCP will propose. Dawn showed versions of this map earlier and the history of KIUC adding sites over the years. So you can see many familiar names there. But the HCP is proposing to upgrade some of those sites, add more predator-proof fencing, which is shown in the red there. So in the Upper Minoa Valley and Upper Limahuli Preserve, those are proposed predator exclusion fences that would exclude all ground-based mammalian predators, as well as 2 smaller sites. You can see red dots there on the map for what we call Pohakea PF, or predator-proof fence, as well as Honopu PF on the far left for a predator-proof fence there as well. And in both of those cases, in fact, in all 4 cases, one of the purposes of the predator-proof fence is to have these social attraction sites that Andre talked about earlier, where we can actually create new colonies, if you will, by attracting birds into the area that are going to have much higher survivorship and much higher reproductive success. And then the blue hatching is indicating existing ungulate fencing, which is keeping out pigs and deer. And in those areas, you would still need to have fairly intensive predator control for rats, for cats, as well as predator control that's feasible anyway for barn owls. So I think I said what I wanted to on this site or in this slide. Any questions? Okay. And then again, just a preview of what's to come in the proposed HCP. This just lists those 10 conservation sites and shows you what is proposed in each one, where we have the 4 predator-proof fence sites: Upper Limahuli, Upper Manoa, Pohakea PF, and Honopu PF. And then at all the other sites, predator control will also occur, as well as invasive plant species management on an as-needed basis.
I just want to add a sort of a caveat to the Honopu site. That's a site that's preliminary or tentative. That's a site still in discussion. It's a site currently being funded by some other grant programs, and so we're working with DOFA and U.S. Fish and Wildlife to hopefully take over the long-term management, but it is still in discussion. So just want to make sure you saw those footnotes on that.
Thanks, Dawn. So finally, in terms of schedule and next steps, we have submitted to DOFA and the Fish and Wildlife Service our first administrative draft. in December. And that was the first completed document. The agencies had seen a large share of the HCP before that, but this was the first complete administrative draft, and they're currently reviewing that. There's also the environmental impact statement process under both HEPA and NEPA that has begun. We're anticipating a public draft HCP in the summer or fall of this year. And we do expect that a draft HCP would be released under the state process first, and then followed by a few months later, the formal NEPA review process and revised HCP for a public review draft for the federal process. And as Dawn mentioned, our goal is to complete the HCP by the summer of next year. And so the last bullet there just shows you some of the topics that we anticipate talking with you later about and bringing you more details of the proposed HCP once we've made a little more progress with DOFA and the Fish and Wildlife Service on some of the key issues. So I think that is it. Yes.
Surprise, surprise, I have more questions. So my understanding of the history of all of this is that if you look at the precipitous 90% decline of the populations based on the data between 1993 and 2013, that they're directly correlated with KIUC's decision not to put the power lines underground following Hurricane Iniki in 1992. And I understand that the justification for that is a lack of money. We are now in a new reality with the Infrastructure and Jobs Act that was passed by Congress and signed into law by the president, which opened up huge funding opportunities to do stuff like putting power lines underground. So maybe David Bissell could answer this question, but is KIUC exploring or planning to do write grants to put power lines underground? Because obviously no power lines means no take, not just minimize take. So I'd like to hear the answer to that. And if not, I would like to know why not. Thank you.
Yeah, we're still assessing what's going to be available under the infrastructure bill. We think it's unlikely that we'd be able to do a large scale undergrounding of our transmission lines under the program, but we are monitoring, and we're looking at all ways to try to minimize the take. So I think it's unlikely, but we'll just have to see. Yeah,
The entire island, I would see why that's close to impossible, but maybe some key sections like the Kalia corridor that have massive amounts of take documented scientifically and things like that.
I'll just add here that the Kalia corridor was in 2020 was an area of heavy focus for minimization. We removed the static wire, and that several miles of line are covered in diverters. So we did some monitoring on that after the minimization was completed, and we'll have some results this next year to validate the estimated efficacy of those actions. But we expect a vast reduction due to those efforts.
Okay, thank you. And then as we all know, 195D, where applicants are required to demonstrate cumulative net benefit to the species. So just want to make sure that we have some clear estimates that are founded in data about how we expect populations to be benefiting cumulatively from this project. I really haven't seen any numbers yet, so I'd like to see that in the HCP.
Yes, we're very aware of that standard and hope to demonstrate meeting that standard to you once we show you the results of the population dynamics model.
Thank you.
I've got a couple of questions. First of all, thank you very much for the presentation. It's really excellent to see this finally moving forward. We've been talking about this at the ESRC for many years, and I'm glad to see it's transitioning into the final version of it. A couple things. One is, Kavika, hit it first in terms of the undergrounding, but we have talked about that as being a possibility before, and certainly I would encourage looking at certain hotspots in terms of potential, trying to look at that as an option. Another option that was talked about a number of years ago was the possibility of, in some of those key areas, of trying to plant trees that would be growing above the power lines, on the Mocha side there. It's certainly simpler and easier than undergrounding. Is that even feasible? So that's something, just like to know if that's a possible option also to look at. One thing I would like to request is it possible to get copies of these slides as a background document that we on the ESRC could have? That would be very useful. There's a lot of information in here, and I realize it's preliminary, but still that would be a useful thing just to have it in place. I was taking notes, but I can only write so fast. And finally, the other thing is I'm very excited with the monitoring and modeling that's being done to estimate take. And I'm hoping at some point that we on the ESRC would have the opportunity to discuss with you and the folks who are doing that modeling as being something that possibly we might want to explore as something we could use also for estimating better estimating take for Hawaiian hoary bats, because we have a real challenge with that one also in terms of just looking for body counts. It doesn't really work very well there. So anyway, thank you very much for the presentation. Oh, I guess the last thing I wanted to ask was, on this last slide here, I'm a little bit confused in terms of when we on the ESRC are going to be receiving, the draft for our review. If I'm interpreting this here, it seems like we're the caboose on the train, that after it's gone through the public review and so forth, then it comes to the ESRC, and it's almost like we're looking at trying to just rubber stamp it. Obviously, we have a lot of. The whole reason for the ESRC being an advisory board is to help advise on the biology. It's not an administrative committee by any means. And so the kind of questions that we bring up in discussions like this, and certainly when you get into looking at the full draft, are some key things that may be very useful for you in terms of retooling the draft document to really meet the goal of minimizing or avoiding as much take as possible, or come up with efficient ways to offset that take. So I'm hoping that we'll be seeing that sooner than later, just to be able to have our input come in, so we don't just simply waste some time that we then come in later on with some big questions that sort of slow the process down. The sooner the better would be useful. So thank you very much again.
A couple of comments to your questions. Maybe the first one is the easy one. Yes, we can absolutely make the slides available, so that's not a problem at all. A couple quick comments on having trees planted or encouraged to grow around the power lines. There's obviously a trade-off between power lines and trees from a reliability standpoint. But we have, over a number of years, tried to reach out to landowners and in certain areas where the trees would have some potential to grow, mainly the Kailua area. And we also, outside of trade-offs to the reliability side, we have view plane issues with landowners. So we weren't very successful. I don't think we were successful at all with the landowners on getting any commitment or willingness to plant trees. So that one kind of went by the wayside.
But what we have, even though the potential to plant trees doesn't seem feasible, what we have learned in the last couple of years, based on the modeling that Ark and Andre and Mark have been doing, is that application of LED diverters in high strike areas, particularly power line trail, have a very high estimated efficacy rate and can be installed in a much faster, it's much easier and faster to install those than it is to do a major reconfiguration project. And it's less impactful actually to the land. And so we have a lot of confidence in LED diverters in some of these high strike areas that have been problematic over the years, like Powerline Trail, but that are away from roadways and houses. So that's sort of something that's changed with the data and modeling we've received in the last few years that we feel pretty confident with.
I will add too, and then maybe we can recognize Loyal as well, who I think has had his hand up for a while, that the last chapter of the HCP is called Alternatives to Take. This is a federal requirement that we consider and describe any alternatives that were considered and rejected and why that may reduce take beyond what the HCP proposes. So we do in that chapter discuss line undergrounding and the use of trees for additional shielding and why those just aren't feasible on the scale that we need for this HCP. So you'll be able to see that and review it. And then Jim, back to your question about when the ESRC will be seeing documents. We will work closely with Kate and David Smith on a timeline for that. We do anticipate getting a draft to you prior to the public review period. We do appreciate the ESRC's feedback and expertise, and so we certainly want to take advantage of that. Loyal? Maybe his hand's not up.
Loyal, you there?
Loyal, are you muted?
While he's coming back, if you wouldn't mind, Jim, a couple of the comments that you raised and Kavika that you raised made me think that it might be worth saying this. You know, over the last 6 or 7 years, our understanding of what's going on with seabirds on Kauai has changed dramatically. I think what we thought when we went into the short-term HCP was that the majority of the take was centered around those areas where we knew birds were coming down and we could see them coming down, particularly around bridges and in areas where Ainley had done some of his work previously. The world has changed since then. And I think as a conservation community and as people on this committee, we're going to have to wrestle with the fact that, you know, Andre and his team have collected a lot of data that then inform our understanding of where take is occurring, why take is occurring, what the options are for reducing take, and the impact of that take on the function of the population, because that has changed as well. What we now understand about the impact of the loss of adults on that breeding population is very different than what we had thought it was 10 years ago. And the models reasonably need to take that into account as well. And they are, right? Like that's a lot of the work that's being done both on the KIUC side and the Fish and Wildlife Service and DOFA side right now is really trying to ascertain what the impact of take is on the function and viability of those populations. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done. But I think that one of the hardest things that we have to wrestle with is that what we thought about seabirds 10 years ago isn't the best available information anymore.
Michelle, in acknowledgement of your long institutional knowledge on this topic, maybe you can share from your perspective how our understanding has changed and what yours is now at least.
You know, and I would actually ask Andre and others to weigh in here too. But, you know, when I first started working on seabirds on Kauai, it was back just as the short-term HCP was kind of getting off the ground. And a lot of that short-term HCP was actually dedicated to getting more information on seabirds. And at the time, the short-term HCP really focused minimization on things like growing trees, undergrounding lines in really key obvious areas, trying to pick up downed birds that you could see and actually searching on the ground for them. And all of those methodologies, while they were considered to be the best available that we had at the time, have now been demonstrated to have serious weaknesses in their overall efficacy. That doesn't mean that they weren't the best that we could do at the moment, but we now have better tools and a better understanding of those functions. You know, Andre did a quick overview today of some of that new information. I know we did something last summer where we did an even deeper dive on that new information. But we now know that the birds that actually hit the ground are only a small percentage of actually what is being taken. We now know a little bit more about the life history components, the age structure of the birds that are hitting lines, and therefore what that impact that has to the populations. We now have better tools and technologies to help inform both minimization and mitigation. And we have a better idea of those actions that are going to have the greatest benefits to the species.
Michelle, one quick question. You know, on the Kauai Seabirds HCP, there's a distinction made between lethal and non-lethal take. Is that being applied in this case?
It is. So just like KSHCP, there are a couple different forms of seabird take, right? You have take in the form of mortality, you have take in the form of injury, and then you have take in the form of lost eggs and chicks as a result of lost adult individuals. The big difference between KSHCP and this one is that with KSHCP, you're talking predominantly about juveniles, first-year birds that are on their way out from their breeding colonies, right? Whereas in this HCP, you're talking about predominantly adult birds or subadult birds rather than just juveniles. Jim, does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think just to speak to what Michelle was saying, it was a slide that Don had earlier as well. I mean, we are talking like, you know, a decade now of data collection and refinement of methodologies and arrival of new technologies, both in terms of understanding take itself and also how to offset that through minimization methods and techniques up in the colonies for predator control. So I think, Michelle, you put it really well there in that, you know, when we first started this, like the idea was just to wander around under lines and count dead birds. And we know that just does not work. It's impossible. I mean, it was a good idea, but it just doesn't work. And things like,
try.
Yeah. But when you look at somewhere like the Power Line Trail, which was known to be, it was definitely known to be a hotspot of collisions, but that was just because there were some birds found underneath there. Once you start acoustically monitoring across the island and understand, you know, the scale of the problem, but also the focal points of the problem, I mean, those kind of things have evolved. And then how do you tackle that problem from a minimization point of view in an effective way that massively reduces take, but also is logistically feasible and cost effective? I mean, and I think we do have those technologies now, things like, you know, these new tools, these new minimization efforts, which are, you know, still something that we have to study. And that's going to be a focus of the work over the next few years, is looking at how this minimization efficacy is actually occurring on the ground. Like, how effective is it, making sure, as continuing to make sure there aren't issues with these kind of tools. We've designed things like the laser fences and then put those in the background because of logistical issues and development issues, and gone for more immediate tools. We've even things like predator control with good natures. I mean, the good natures themselves have evolved over time. So I think we're in a good, although it's taken a long period of time, I mean, a decade's a long time, we are in a position where we have a really
I think we might have lost Andre. I'll jump in here and anticipate what he was about to say. Is we have a lot of information that we feel more confident in today than we did before, and we have a strong team at this point to carry out implementation. Hopefully he can jump back on at some point soon.
Look at you guys finishing each other's sentences. So amazing.
So we're in a really strong position.
Oh dear.
Andre, if you can hear, maybe you shut off your video. That might help with the streaming.
I think he went to the same place Loyal did.
I will just say that, like, as our understanding of the take has changed, that has radically changed the nature of the long-term HCP, right? So that's a lot of what's happened over the last couple of years. The short-term HCP anticipated a relatively low level of take because it was based on the number of birds that you could physically see come down. And the long-term HCP takes into account the full extent of the take, which is a lot, which is why the conservation program is also a lot. And the minimization program is a lot. It is by far the largest HCP that has ever come before this committee, and it's the largest HCP that I have ever worked on.
Yeah, and I just want to add too is when Seabirds first came to the ESRC, which was way before the time Michelle was talking about, we knew nothing. We absolutely knew nothing. We had records of birds coming down, but we really had no idea in terms of where the colonies were or having any clue at all in terms of doing any kind of management or mitigation. And so it's really it's very exciting to see, and you know, my tenure on the ESRC has been really quite long, and watching this whole evolution over time. And just to see where we are right now with Seabirds in terms of all the effort that's been put in through many parties and you know, lots of work in the field and analysis of the data and modeling and so forth, where we stand right now. And it's very exciting to see that we have a much better understanding and real opportunities to do mitigation that's really meaningful and trackable. So, you know, hats off to everybody who's been involved in that. And I know, Andre, you and your team have been a big part of that whole thing.
Yeah, we also don't want to forget the green sea turtle. This would be the very first HCP in Hawaii for the green sea turtle. And while it is a small part of the plan, it's a new program and something that KIUC is proud of and excited to implement.
Hi everyone. I think I'm back. I may have frozen in mid-speech, but anyway.
You did.
I'm sure we all got the gist of what I was saying, hopefully.
We did.
Someone filled in for you.
Given the progress,
Probably not as eloquent. I'm sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Given the progress that's been noted by multiple people, I also, just for the sake of ESRC and the broader mission or broader aims of the committee, I want to mention too that it would be really great to see opportunities to apply the lessons learned more broadly than KIUC, right? And so there's the Dark Skies Initiative bill that was passed in 2017 that certainly the lessons learned could be applied more broadly at the county and state levels. And so just want to put that plug into ESRC to look for opportunities to apply these lessons learned.
Yeah, and that's an effort that I've been working with some legislators on, is, you know, just trying to get to minimize lighting generally. Like DOT right now is putting lights up where they've never been before. They just lighted the entire Poly Highway. It's killing birds where they were never killed before. I think it's really important. You know, we just really don't need all of these highway lights. And I remember, you know, in the years past, I'd go over to Molokai and sit on the west side beaches at night, and you could just see this giant light plume over Honolulu and another big light plume over Kailua. And man, it was just completely lighting up the night sky. You can hardly see the stars anymore. So it just seems extremely unnecessary to have all that lighting. So it'd be nice if we could get away from some of that. I've been places where they don't light their highways and they minimize the lighting even in their residential areas. And I mean, I for one really like it, and it'd be nice if we could kind of reverse the trend of lighting everywhere and rely on our headlights a little more and just try to minimize that. So that, I think a lot of the minimization, I got to give credit to KIUC for really pushing that minimization because you know, the best thing we can do is just not kill birds in the first place. And just to add on to that too, I just want to say I'm really impressed. I want to thank Dave Bissell and his team. Like, you know, it was a real struggle for a while. We're having some issues, and there was just a lot of friction, and David came in and took control of the situation and got Don on board, and they have a really good team right now, super good team. The Fish and Wildlife Service has been doing a lot of heavy lifting on this, and we have a lot of expertise with the ESRC. So I think we're well positioned to come up with something really significant and something that's going to be effective for conserving birds and pushing landscape scale ecosystem restoration and management generally. So I really want to look at it as a big picture approach to landscape scale management on Kauai, and I think this effort can help us advance that. Generally, there's a lot of things we can do on Kauai, and so a lot of the seabird work can feed into that. So we want to be partners. As Forestry and Wildlife, we want to be partners as well, because we own a bunch of the land or manage a bunch of the land for the public, and would like to see this be part of a bigger ecosystem restoration effort over there. So thanks very much to everybody involved on the KIUC team and Fish and Wildlife Service for all their hard work.
Yeah, I have one more question. Sounds like we're wrapping up, but I do have one really important question, and I want us to really think about cumulative net benefit. In the early days when we were talking about this, we were saying, well, cumulative net benefit means getting the population back to those 1993 numbers before KIUC made the decision not to put those power lines underground. I know there's been a lot of pushback from KIUC on that notion, so I would like to know, what are you guys thinking about? What does cumulative net benefit look like? At a population level.
Yeah, I think we're not in a position to get into that discussion today because we really want to focus on the results of our population dynamics model, and that'll give everybody, I think, a common way to talk about those estimates. And I think that'll help the discussion quite a bit.
Okay, that's fair enough. Just know that I will be looking at that specifically.
Given that that's come up a few times, I'll just ask David that we make sure we have enough time allotted for that. But I think several of us are going to be very interested in the inner workings of the model.
And then one question I would have, and perhaps it's in the bigger HCP presentation to come, is kind of just the understanding of the underlying land ownership of all of these different conservation units, and just kind of being assured of the stability and the agreements with those landowners, so that we know that 30 years from now, if something gets sold, that we know there's going to be continuity in the management. So I would appreciate kind of, seeing those maps. I knew some of it was DOFA land, some of it's NTBG, but just kind of that bigger picture, and then how that fits in perhaps to the Kauai watershed management units as well in their long-term goals.
Hey, Michelle, maybe you can share with us from Fish and Wildlife's perspective what cumulative net benefit you're expecting to see, so that we have that in our heads.
I'll ask Aaron to jump in a little bit too. David's right. Some of this is really informed by the model. And so I do think that we need good modeling parameters to help us talk about what the impact of the taking is on an already degraded baseline condition of the species. And we also need some help in determining what population is needed in order to continue into the future. Given the extent of take here and the impact of that take on the current level of population, the way in which we are thinking about net benefit is maybe a little bit different than the way that we have done before for other species. So, the way in which we have looked at it for water birds or nene, to some extent even for bats, this is a way different scenario. We're talking about population level effects at a species level. And in order to make up for that, you are talking about managing it at a landscape level and ensuring in the long term. Sorry, I know I'm not intentionally being evasive, but I don't have easy numbers for you, Kavika.
Okay,
It's not
let me ask
a number target, but I would
Okay.
say that we need to have a reasonable assurance that there is sufficient numbers, space, and management to see that species persist into the future and continue to increase.
Right. Okay. So that's kind of the crux of my question, right?
Yeah.
So does cumulative net benefit mean it goes extinct at a slower rate, or does cumulative net benefit mean that we put it on a trajectory towards population recovery? And are we going to be okay if all they do is demonstrate that the species is going extinct at a slower rate?
At least on the Fish and Wildlife Service side, we are looking at it as we need to see that the species is persisting at a viable level into the future and increasing. So no, it is not going extinct at a slower rate.
Is that understood by the applicant and its consultants?
Yes, it is. I do want to clarify, and I think you seem to be implying that the goal of this HCP should be to restore the population to pre-1990s.
I'm just asking what your current thinking is, because in the early days, that was what was discussed. So has it evolved, or I've been asking, what are you guys thinking about cumulative net benefit? I'm not getting a straight answer.
Well, our goal in the HCP is to meet the State Endangered Species Act standard, which is to provide a net benefit to the species, to each of the covered species. And so we're first quantifying what that effect is after the minimization, and then to provide a net benefit. So our goal for the 2 covered species is by the end of the permit term to ensure that there's a net population increase that we expect to then continue over time. We can't achieve that right away because of the time it takes to get these conservation sites producing birds. But over time, we expect to do that, and that's what the population model will show. So hopefully that answers your question conceptually.
Okay, yeah, just to be clear, the delaying extinction is not cumulative net benefit in my mind.
And that's not what I said. We're not just slowing the rate of decline. We're going to propose that the rate of decline be reversed.
Thank you.
I see Loyal's hand up again. Did it go down and go back up, or is it just still up?
I think we got him back. Loyal, you there?
Loyal seems to have turned into a small island in the Pacific.
I'll text him.
It's covered in seabirds, though, I can guarantee you that.
Maybe.
Loyal had gotten booted, but I just readmitted him, so hopefully we can talk now.
Well, we really appreciate your time today, and I'm glad this was a helpful presentation and discussion.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Do you have any other questions from the committee?
Yeah, this is Loyal. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yay. Sorry, I just for some reason have trouble with some of these larger Zoom calls with my new system. Anyway, I just had one question, and it's actually on the short-term HCP. And for the short-term HCP, did that totally offset all the take estimated to occur during the permit period?
Michelle, I may need some help in answering this just because of how it was written. Yeah. and my learning curve.
Sorry, Loyal, you cut I'm having IT issues also, and my monitor cut out right at that moment. Can you repeat the question? I'm so sorry.
No problem. I got cut off a whole bunch of times on Zoom this time, but it's just with the short-term HCP. Did the short-term HCP fully offset the amount of take estimated to occur during the permit period?
Estimated to occur, or that did occur?
Well, that did occur, I guess.
I will say no. It did not. So then we found out at some point in the midst of the short-term HCP that take was far exceeding the level that was authorized under the HCP. Now remember that HCP was only permitted on the federal side. It was not a state HCP at the time. It was not an active HCP under 195D. But on the federal side, we became aware, I think in 2000 and, gosh, you know what? I'm not even going to say a date. I can't recall. I want to say 2011, but it could have been a little bit later than that. That take was being exceeded from what was anticipated to occur under the short-term HCP. At that point, we reinitiated our biological opinion, which has subsequently led to the development of the long-term HCP. So the long-term HCP is intended to address what we learned during the short-term HCP and address the full extent of the effects that are occurring as a result of KIUC activities.
Thank you.
Does that include accounting for take that occurred after the end of the short-term HCP and when this new one comes up, or where does that fit into any mitigation?
Yeah, so the short-term HCP was a 3-year HCP that could be extended up to 5 years. The 5 years ended several years ago, so there is a gap between the end of the full extent of the short-term HCP and the long-term HCP. KIUC, to their credit, has continued to do all of the activities that were in their short-term HCP and then some. So they have done all additional minimization projects, additional mitigation projects, scaled up monitoring, scaled up a bunch of different things from what was articulated in their short-term HCP, and continued it through these years of gap between the short-term HCP and the long-term HCP. And then in advance of the long-term HCP, for the conservation actions that they know are likely to occur under the long-term HCP, they have gone further and actually started implementing some of those actions now. The overall goal of the HCP, Jim, is at a population level scale. So it's not quite accurate to say that the intent of the long-term HCP is to make up for the take in the short-term HCP. It doesn't quite work that way. But it is intended to step for the population level effects of the continued take on an extremely degraded baseline condition of the species.
Thank you.
Dawn, is there anything that you want to add there? Did I capture that in a way that? Okay.
Yeah, thank you for answering that. I appreciate that, Michelle. Yeah. I mean, you covered this and we covered it in the PowerPoint, but I do want to just reemphasize the sort of progressive increase in not only mitigation, but minimization. So the long-term HCP also will be trying to capture all of those actions as well as the impacts of the taking.
Any other questions or follow up on that? I mean, the bottom line on the short term was, we had a massive population decline. We did bring money to the table for the project and we learned a lot. So we're in a good position now, I think, in terms of understanding the situation and management. Obviously, undergrounding all the lines would be superior, but it's also extraordinarily expensive. And so, trying to find a way forward where we can recover birds and KIUC can meet their legal obligations, and we can try to provide some relief for the birds going forward. That's going to be our goal. Some of it gets wrapped up in legal issues, and we can cover that in more detail.
Oh crud, my monitor just went out again. If you can still hear me, I'll just say that from the Fish and Wildlife Service perspective, it is really important that the conservation strategy that is included within the HCP is comprehensive in nature. And what I mean by that, all just be minimization. It has to be a combination of minimization and mitigation in order to start seeing a reversal of the declining population trend and actually get the species or the Kauai population to a level where it is viable and increasing. Yeah, minimization alone isn't going to cut it. So I think that as we look at this conservation strategy, KIUC has done a lot of work on both minimization and compensatory mitigation by expanding what colony management looks like and can look like in the future. And those two things are going to have to work in combination with each other in order to help get the population past the lowest level of population decline, which is still in front of us, right? I'll echo Dave's thanks to KIUC and the fact that we are poised for, I would say, the first time in the last 10 years to really make this come to fruition. I'm really grateful for David Zippin and his team. I think they've brought a lot of experience and capacity to the development of this HCP. I'm really pleased that Don has been brought on as project manager on the KIUC side. That has brought a lot of capacity and coordination to the development of this HCP, and I am feeling very good about this moving forward to hopeful permit issuance within the next year or so. And that's good. It's been a while since we've had that kind of timeline to work on.
Thank you, Michelle.
Many, many thanks to the field team, Andre, Mark, and crew, as well as Kyle and crew, and the expertise of Pacific Rim and everyone else.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, if there's no other questions, then we'll turn everybody loose. Really appreciate the review, and I'll do some follow-up on some of the questions that I heard that maybe weren't answered completely. So I'll follow up with our Attorney General's office on that. And if there's anything, if nobody has anything else, I think we're gonna cut you all loose. And thank you very much for KIUC for the review, and we'll keep the ESRC in the loop, and encourage as well KIUC to reach out to individual ESRC members to try to help either get information or resolve issues that they have, issues and concerns.
Thank you, David. We can do that.
Okay, well, thank you very much. gonna end
Thank
the
you,
meeting.
everybody.
Appreciate it. Thank you all.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Goodbye.